This video shows you how to make your own bias binding and then how to join the two ends on the straight of grain to create either longer pieces of binding or to join two ends together to create a continuous binding piece to finish an armhole, neck or hem end. I'm going to demonstrate how to use bias binding makers, first of all to make simple bias binding, but also how to join sections together. So I've got two bias binding makers. The first one here is a Clover brand name and it has 18 written on it, and that refers to the millimeter width of the opening of the end of it. So the opening here is about 18 millimeters wide, or the finished bias binding will be roughly 18 millimeters wide. The other one that I have is this one here by Nui. It is a 12 millimeter. So the resulting bias binding from this one will be 12 millimeters. So maybe a little bit harder to work with if you're about to invest in one. This one here I find the easiest to work with and the most sort of versatile. I've cut out a piece of fabric. So typically if you're matching your bias binding to your garment, you're probably left with small short little pieces of fabric like this, and you're probably needing to join pieces together. So I have the selvage edge over here and the cross grain here. So the set square that I'm working with has a 45-degree angle. So just take care that your set square has that angle. I'm going to start first of all by making a line on it anywhere. It doesn't really matter where the first line goes. Because I'm going to work with the larger tool, 18 millimeter, the rule of thumb is to get a good bias binding width, double the size of the maker. So if this is 18 millimeters, the correct width for the binding is 3.6 centimeters or 36 millimeters. It's easier to just take a millimeter off and make it 35. So 3.5 centimeters. But take care, stiffer fabrics may need less width, and thinner fabrics or softer fabrics may need slightly more added to it. So you really need to test first of all. So with this fabric, I'm going to take 35 millimeters. Mark out strips the width you require following your first bias line. The ends that we will be joining when we're joining these pieces will be the ends here and the ends here. So it's important that this is cut at a right angle to your selvage. So make sure that this is a straight line before you start. Make sure this is a straight line before you start. And the first thing that I will do when I'm done is cut away the selvage piece here, resulting in a very straight edge. And again, on this side, ideally it's straight. You can straighten these up afterwards, so don't worry too much if they're not straight yet. As a general guide, if I'm working on a project and I know I need binding, at this point I trace out more than I need because it's quite fast. I've got the fabric pressed, I've got the mark here, it's easy to keep moving the set square along. If I'm working on larger pieces, sometimes a meter stick happens to be the perfect width and I can line the meter stick up in that way. But as a general guide, cut more than you think you're going to need. And a lot of the time you're going to need all of those pieces. Okay, so before I cut out a few of these sections here, I'm going to cut away the selvage that I won't need. And then I'm going to cut out a few sections, maybe work with one or two of these sections in the middle. It's important here to cut as accurately as you can through the middle of the line, because we're going to be joining the ends together. And if one piece is slightly narrower than the next, it just becomes a pain in the neck trying to join them together. So I'm going to work with the two sections here. Now, to join two pieces together, we need to align the angles so that they match. So make sure that you're not trying to join them in this direction. What we're looking at here is a piece that's on the straight of grain. So you can see that this is one of the straight of grains and this is the other. What I'm going to do to make it clearer in the video is I'm going to use pencil and draw a line where I am going to put the seam allowance, and we can choose what size the seam allowance here will be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up as 0.75 because that will align quite nicely with the foot on my sewing machine, and I can use the foot as a guide. Repeat the same for the other side. Now it is essential to double check that we really do have the straight of grain on the edge here. A good way to double check is to pull away fibres until you get one entire piece of thread coming away from the edge of the fabric. Okay, so that has come away the entire length of the piece of bias. So at this point, if I hold it up to the light, it looks pretty bang on. I've removed 1 or 2 threads and it's still very, very straight. So this one is good. So if I double check on this one, now there is a slight little telltale that there is a thread starting to come away here. Of the loose threads here, or the frayed edges, I've got slightly more on this side than I have on that side. So I know with bias binding I can get away with that, but just to be very clear in the video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim away those excess threads. Okay, and I'll amend that line slightly. Okay, actually the difference is so slight, it really makes no difference, but at least I know the edge of the fabric is perfectly aligned. Now the next stage is probably the most important bit of aligning the two. So place them together edge to edge, right side to right side. A typical reaction is for people to align the very, very end here with the very, very end here, but we need to think this is where we're sewing. And you can see when I hold it up to the light here, if I sew it like this, I will only be sewing 1 layer as far as here, and at the end I'm only sewing 1 layer. So the real trick here is to align edge to edge, and what I call this is aligning them so that you have proper dog ears. So for me, I like to think of this as a dog, or you can think of it as a fox, but make sure the 2 pieces are aligned edge to edge up here, and that we have a little ear sticking out here and a little ear sticking out here. Now the perfect size of ear here is when the 2 align, so that the line we're planning to stitch on here is lined up perfectly with the V shape that that little ear is creating. So to me, if I start in the middle of the V, that I can sew along the line here and come out at the other end of the V while having followed that line. So I'm going to put a pin in at the top, and I'm going to put a pin in at the bottom. When we sew on the machine, we start sewing at the V here and we finish sewing at the V here. And that is the same procedure irrespective of what depth your seam allowance is. So just as a word of warning, if I start sewing at the very top here, I'm going to end up with a knot of threads. It's much better to start about 1/2 centimetre down, stitch forward, stitch back to the beginning, and then stitch down to the end. Okay, so I'm going to press the seam open, going in with the iron. Cut away the ears sticking out from the side of the binding. Okay, so now I'm ready to feed this through the bias binding maker. What I need is the little maker. Make sure that you feed it through so that any of your seam allowances are facing upwards when feeding through. So putting the point through the maker like this, and that is why there is that little groove there. Okay, so you can use a pin to feed the fabric through until it pops out on this side. Now it is a little bit confusing at first of all, but if I pull a little bit through and then I see the first bit beginning to fold over here, the same fold here at the top as I have at the bottom. So before I do anything, give this a little bit of a press. Okay, so I'm going to place a pin here in the middle. So as I pull, that's what the little handle is here for. As you're pulling backwards, pull quite gently. And as I pull maybe 1 or 2 centimeters, don't pull too tight or you'll pull the whole bias narrower. And you need to pat the yarn down. So rather than sliding the yarn the whole way across as I work, I need to do it piece by piece. So that's the first section. So pull the bias binding maker out, tap it in again, pat, pull, pat, and just keep your eyes open for the bias at any point getting narrower, which would indicate that you're pulling too tight, or if the folded edge is getting tighter on one side or narrower or wider on one side, then you may need to curve the binder out in one direction or down in the other direction to counteract that. Continue in this way until you reach the seam. So I'm just approaching the join here, so a little bit of caution as the join goes through is normally a good idea because it can be a little bit tighter as it comes out. Okay, so it's already catching on the edge, so you might need to just give it a little hand to go in, or add as you're pulling, just to allow it to relax back. So rather than the whole thing pulling tight here, just to release that tension as you go. Okay, because it is quite thick there, and this is quite a thick fabric. I'm going to move the pin a little bit closer here, and I'm just going to help protect the stretch here as I pull it through. Okay, so that was the first bit here. So a little bit of readjusting by hand. Okay, that still looks quite good. I think that's the worst of it now. No, that second bit there did not want to come through particularly well. So again, a little bit of adjustment by hand. If you're working with a thinner fabric, that may not even be noticeable when you get to that section. Okay, so that's it through. So just make sure that it's still happy when the last bit gets through. Finish the length of the binding as before. The last little bit again tends to pop out. So again, just a little bit of rearranging by hand here, and we should be able to get a good turn on the end. That is the join here now. It's spreading the bulk out over a much larger area, so that when I sew this down or sew it into place, if I was folding the bias binding into place, most of the bulk is now distributed between this area and this area. Now I've joined a piece of fabric together here representing a sleeve end, and I'm going to pin the bias binding that I've got onto this to work out how much of the binding I need to bind the end of the sleeve. The first step will literally be measuring the bias binding. So what I'm going to do is to pin the bias binding on, but the easiest way to measure is to open up the binding. So this crease here is where we're doing the measuring. So I'm going to put a pin in here at a specific point on that line. Okay, so I've chosen this point on that folded line. So now without pulling, I'm going to open up the binding and line it along, or the exact measurement of the end of the sleeve in this case. So again, very careful not to pull it here. If you're working with a very delicate fabric, it may start to stretch. Okay, so working over the previous section here until I meet that pin. So that's where my pin was starting out, and I have now wrapped the binding the whole way along, giving me an exact measurement back to the pin. Now, of course, I could measure the end of the sleeve and simply measure that out on the binding, but a lot of the time you're doing this on neck, and it's not as easy then to measure exactly where the binding is going to end up. So I'm more in the habit of doing it this way. So these two pins are directly over each other. Now I'm happy to take it back off again because I know exactly what the circumference is. So again, re-pinning here. Place the two ends of the binding together to make a decision about the direction that the seam will be cut in. The two ends will need to be cut at matching angles. The binding on this side has the cut going in this direction, so I need to make sure, like when I joined on the other side, that I can cut a seam allowance here that will match the seam allowance on that side, with the binding on this side also going in this direction. So I'll start by defining the side that I started pinning on. Okay, so we're looking for the straight of grain that goes right through where the pin is here. So one way of doing that is lining the set square up here. So this is a 45-degree angle set square, bringing it over until it aligns exactly with the pin, because that is going to be my sewing line and I will need to add the seam allowance on. And now I can add my seam allowance. So again, the seam allowance is 0.75. Cut away the excess fabric. Okay, it is essential when cutting to have the bias binding open. So just to demonstrate what happens if I don't open the bias binding before cutting, I'm using a piece on the other end and cutting the straight of grain, and when I open that out, I now have a zigzag line that I can't sew. I need to work out the cut on this side is going in this direction, so the cut on the other side also needs to go in the same direction, and it's very easy to forget when you work across the entire piece and you get to the other side. So I normally do a double check. I cut the first one with the set square in this direction, so I now need to move along and to do the exact same procedure on this side. And not to get confused about the direction of the seam allowance, this is the net edge, and then I need to add the seam allowance on this side. So first of all, drawing a line where the pin is, right where the pin goes through is my sewing line, and now I need to add the seam allowance on. Okay, so that is 0.75. So now I can trim the excess away. So we need to join this side to this side. So if I open these out, looking at the binding, make sure you have no twists and place it together right side to right side. Okay, and we again have this uneven edge. This is good. Then twist the two pieces, aligning the seam allowances together, and you should now have the letter O. Now the same as before, keeping these edges aligned, I need to move the line up here until the V here has that line right in the middle of it. Okay, so this looks fairly exact to me. I'm going to put a pin in it. So again, if I compare it to when I joined the two pieces before, I have this little almost fox face. I've got the two little dog ears sticking out on both sides, but I suppose because I've now pressed the creases in, I also have a double check. I can either turn to this side and see, do the lines here appear to join? The other thing that we're looking for as a guide is the crease here and the crease here should be making an X shape. The line that we're sewing along should pass directly through the middle of the X in order for the lines to line up accurately. Okay, so again, seam allowance 0.7, start sewing here, which happens to be the middle of the V, and the middle of the V is always the right answer when you're working out where to start sewing and where to finish sewing. This is the piece that I've joined. It still has this O shape that we spoke about beforehand. If I fold it out the correct way, it still makes a continuous binding. So what I need to do to finish the seam as I've joined it here is to press it out. Trim away the ears. All I need to do is to repair the crease as it was beforehand. Taking care not to press the whole thing. Okay, so that is the joined piece of binding ready to put onto your garment depending on which technique you're using. So that was the first join and this is the second join. I'm going to press this in half and demonstrate then how to do a very simple sandwiching on technique. So in order to sandwich on, I need to fold the bias binding perfectly in half. Press as you go. It's essential here when folding that we don't have one piece behind the other piece. Really, these edges need to be exactly on top of each other because I'm going to machine sandwich this onto the sleeve and I want to know that these edges are directly above each other. So this is my continuous binding here. So this is now ready to sandwich onto the finished sleeve. This is the finished sleeve, so I'm going to start sandwiching and I'm going to make sure that one of these joins doesn't end up hitting where I've got a French seam here because that would be too much for the machine to handle in terms of layers. So placing this overlapped seam here, maybe just behind one of those sections. So placing the binding halfway onto the fabric and then folding it over, and I'm not going to use too many pins here, and I'm going to pin perpendicular to the edge. So we need to find the other side of the sleeve for measuring this in. So directly opposite the pin, I'm going to place a pin showing me where the other half of the sleeve is. And I'm going to do the same with the binding to make sure that I'm easing this on evenly. So for the binding, that halfway point is here. So now I need to make sure that this pin aligns with this pin. So aligning the two so that they match accurately, I'll take out this pin, folding this over, and then pinning in place. So if at this point the binding looks slightly bigger or very slightly smaller, it's more likely to look slightly bigger because it may stretch as you're working it. It's important to ease the difference on evenly. When you've pinned either end, continue to pin the center between each set of pins, distributing any excess bias binding as you go. So this is the binding pinned on. I normally will use as few pins as possible because the pinning distorts the shape of the edge of the binding. So I've turned the sleeve inside out. It's going to be slightly easier to attach if it's inside out. And it's also important to point out that we're always stitching on the final outside of the garment here, because if something goes awry in underneath, it's going to be on the inside of the garment and it won't be as visible. At this point, I do want to check that the sleeve itself is right in against the crease here or the join. Stitch the binding 1 millimeter in from the edge. And now for each section, we need to double check that the fabric is still where it needs to be. So double check that it's in on the crease, and now double check that it is sitting flat and happy in this area. Okay, so we're back to the very beginning. So I'm going to stitch until I go over the end of this, and then I will backstitch. Press the binding when you're finished. So this is the finished bias binding. And again, you can see where I started and finished, but if the thread had matched, it would be pretty difficult to tell where the joins are. And again, I think you can really only see here because there's black thread in underneath.